Chapter 1. The Midnight Melody. It was during the dreary winter of 1887 that my friend Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves entangled in what would become one of the most perplexing cases of his illustrious career. London lay shrouded in a thick, pervasive fog that clung to the gas lamps like ghostly fingers, transforming the familiar streets into an otherworldly landscape. The weather had driven most sensible citizens indoors, and we ourselves had spent several comfortable evenings before the crackling hearth at 221B Baker Street, Holmes engrossed in his chemical experiments, and I in the latest medical journals. On this particular evening, the wind howled mournfully outside our windows, rattling the panes with such persistence that even Holmes had abandoned his microscope in favour of his violin. He had just concluded a haunting rendition of Paganini when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, interrupted with the news that Inspector Lestrade awaited us below. "At this hour," I remarked, glancing at the mantel clock which showed 11:30. "It must be urgent." "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied, setting aside his instrument with evident reluctance. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps bring a pot of your strongest tea. I suspect we shall need it before the night is through." Lestrade entered our sitting-room moments later, his coat glistening with moisture from the fog, his usually composed features betraying a marked agitation that immediately captured Holmes's attention. "You've come straight from Belgrave Square," Holmes observed, gesturing the inspector toward the fire. "And whatever you've witnessed there has disturbed even your professional composure." Lestrade's eyes widened. "How could you possibly—" "Your boots bear the distinctive yellow clay found near the recent excavations by the Belgrave Square Gardens. It is wet, but not deeply splattered, suggesting you walked there within the last hour, when the fog had already settled but before the rain began. As for your distress, your left hand has been trembling since you entered, and you've adjusted your collar 3 times in as many minutes, a nervous habit I've observed in you only during the most unsettling cases." The inspector shook his head with a weary smile. "Even after all these years, Mr. Holmes, your methods still astound me. You're correct, of course. I've come from the residence of Sir Richard Crandall, the renowned violinist." "Ah, Crandall!" Holmes exclaimed, his eyes lighting with recognition. "I attended his performance of Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto at St. James's Hall last season. A virtuoso with few equals." "Was a virtuoso," Lestrade corrected grimly. "Sir Richard was found dead in his music room this evening." I noted the subtle shift in Holmes's demeanour, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a stillness that came over him like a predator sensing prey. "Murder, I presume, or you wouldn't be here." "That's just it, Mr. Holmes. I'm not entirely certain what we're dealing with." Lestrade accepted the tea Mrs. Hudson had brought, warming his hands around the cup. "Sir Richard was discovered by his manservant, seated at his desk, quill in hand as if composing. No signs of violence, no indication of struggle. The physician who examined him suggested a heart seizure." Holmes leaned forward. "Then why consult me on what appears to be a natural, if untimely, death?" Lestrade's voice lowered. "Because exactly 1 hour after the physician pronounced him dead, Sir Richard's violin began to play. A silence fell over our sitting-room, broken only by the plaintive moan of the wind and the soft hiss of coal settling in the grate. "Explain yourself," Holmes demanded, his tone betraying neither scepticism nor alarm. Sir Richard's body had been moved to his bedchamber, but his prized Stradivarius remained in its case in the music-room. The door was locked from the outside by Lady Crandall herself, who could not bear to see the instrument after her husband's passing. The servants were attending to the body, and the lady was sedated in her room when the sounds began. A sonata that Sir Richard had reportedly been composing in the weeks before his death. Who witnessed this phenomenon? I asked, unable to hide my incredulity. The manservant, James Barrett, and Sir Richard's protégé, a young violinist named Frederick Winters. They used a spare key to enter the music-room and found the violin back on its stand, not in its case where it had been placed. The room was empty, all windows securely fastened from within. Holmes rose abruptly, pacing before the fire with quickening steps. And the violin, it was actually playing, strings vibrating, bow moving. No, sir. By the time they entered, the music had ceased, but they swear the sound came from within that room, and the instrument had undeniably been moved. Fascinating, Holmes murmured. And you've secured the scene? As best I could. I've left Constable Parker on guard with strict instructions that nothing is to be touched. Lestrade hesitated. There's one more detail, Mr. Holmes. The composition Sir Richard was writing when he died. It was found completed on his desk, the ink still wet on the final notes. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the familiar spark that presaged his immersion in a case. Watson, I believe we shall need our coats. The game is most decidedly afoot. He turned to Lestrade. Who was present in the house at the time of Sir Richard's death? Lady Crandall, of course. The manservant Barrett. The protégé Winters, who dined with them that evening. The housekeeper, Mrs. Giles, and a maid named Ellen. Sir Richard's brother, William Crandall, arrived shortly after the death was discovered. He resides nearby and was summoned immediately. Any visitors earlier in the day? Several. Sir Richard was planning a charity performance for next month. Lady Crandall mentioned a meeting with patrons, though I've yet to obtain a complete list. Holmes nodded briskly. You've done well to bring this to my attention, Lestrade. A locked room, a posthumous performance, and a mysteriously completed composition. It's a symphony of puzzles that demands investigation. As we prepared to venture into the fog-laden night, I could not help but voice my scepticism. Surely there must be a rational explanation, Holmes. A violin cannot play itself, nor can a dead man finish his compositions. My friend regarded me with that familiar half-smile that suggested he was already several steps ahead in his thinking. Indeed, Watson, and yet the most fantastical circumstances often conceal the most mundane of crimes. Remember Lord Blackwood and his apparent resurrection. Magic designed to obscure murder. I suspect we shall find the same here, a very human hand orchestrating these seemingly supernatural events. I nodded, though not entirely convinced. And the purpose of such theatrics? That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover. Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths after Sir Richard's death? What secret might be worth such a bizarre charade? Holmes wrapped his scarf tightly around his neck. Consider this, Watson, a violin that plays after death may indeed be uncanny. But what truly interests me is the composition that was completed. If Sir Richard did not finish it himself, then someone else did, someone familiar enough with his work to convincingly forge his final creation. As we descended the 17 steps to the street below, the fog swirled around us, thick as cemetery shrouds. A hansom cab materialized like a phantom at Holmes's whistle, and we were soon clattering through the deserted streets toward Belgrave Square, where a dead man's violin had played its master's unfinished symphony, and where Sherlock Holmes would begin to unravel threads of a mystery that would lead us through London's musical elite into the darkest chambers of human jealousy and ambition. Chapter 2. The house of the Maestro Belgrave Square stood as an island of genteel prosperity amid the fog, its grand houses looming like sentinels behind wrought-iron fences. As our hansom pulled up before Sir Richard Crandall's residence, I observed the curtained windows, where only a few lights burned, giving the impression of a house already in mourning. A police constable stood sentinel at the door, his collar turned up against the chill. "Constable Parker," Lestrade called as we approached. "Any developments?" "None, sir," the young officer replied. "All quiet since you left." The door was opened by a thin, austere man with prematurely grey hair and the precise movements of one accustomed to anticipating others' needs. His face was drawn, but his composure remained intact despite the evening's disturbances. "Barrett, I presume?" Holmes addressed him directly. "You discovered Sir Richard's body?" The manservant's surprise was evident. "Yes, sir. And you must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Inspector Lestrade mentioned he might consult you." "This is my colleague, Dr. Watson," Holmes continued as we stepped into the warmth of the entrance hall. "I understand you also witnessed the unusual musical occurrence." Barrett's professional demeanour faltered momentarily. "I did, sir. Most disturbing. If you would follow me, Sir Richard remains in his bedchamber, and the music room has been left exactly as we found it." The house possessed the refined elegance one would expect of a celebrated musician's residence. Portraits of composers lined the hallway alongside framed programs from Sir Richard's performances across Europe. The silence that pervaded the space seemed especially profound, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "I should like to see the music room first," Holmes announced. "The body can wait. It is the scene of this ghostly performance that interests me most urgently." Barrett led us to a set of double doors at the rear of the house. Lestrade produced a key, unlocking the room with a solemnity that suggested he half expected another supernatural performance upon our entry. The chamber beyond was spacious, dominated by a grand piano in one corner, and a bay window overlooking what would be, in daylight, a charming private garden. The moment we entered, Holmes became a whirlwind of focused energy, his keen eyes darting from object to object. He examined the windows, tested the floorboards, scrutinized the lock mechanism, all without uttering a word. The room contained several chairs, arranged as for a small audience, bookshelves laden with musical scores, and a writing desk where sheets of manuscript paper remained scattered. "This is where Sir Richard was found?" Holmes inquired, indicating the desk. "Yes, sir," Barrett confirmed. "Seated right there, quill still in his hand. I had brought him his evening brandy at 9 o'clock, and he was engrossed in his composition. When I returned at 10:30 to inquire if he needed anything before retiring, he was—" The manservant's voice trailed off. "And the violin?" Holmes continued, his attention now fixed on an elegant stand near the window where a magnificent instrument rested. It was in its case after Sir Richard was taken upstairs. Lady Crandall insisted upon it. She said she couldn't bear to see it out, as if waiting for him to return. I placed it there myself. Barrett pointed to a velvet-lined case on a side table, and unlocked the room as instructed. Holmes approached the Stradivarius with reverence, his fingers hovering above the polished wood without touching it. And yet, when you and Mr. Winters returned after hearing music, it was here, on this stand. Precisely, sir, as if ready to be played. How many keys exist to this room? 3, sir. Lady Crandall has one, I have one, and there is a spare kept in Sir Richard's study. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And who was aware of the location of this spare key? Anyone in the household might have known. Sir Richard made no secret of it. At that moment our attention was drawn to a tall, slender young man who appeared in the doorway. He had the pale complexion and intense gaze of one devoted to artistic pursuits, with long, nimble fingers that immediately identified him as a musician. "Mr. Winters, I presume," Holmes said, turning to face the newcomer. "Frederick Winters, yes," the young man confirmed. "Lady Crandall mentioned that detectives had arrived. I wanted to offer any assistance I could." His voice carried the slight accent of someone educated on the continent. "You were Sir Richard's student?" I inquired. "Protégé," he corrected with a hint of pride that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. "Sir Richard was preparing me for my debut at St. James's Hall next season. I've been studying under his tutelage for 3 years." Holmes had returned his attention to the desk, carefully examining the manuscript pages. "You dined with the family this evening?" "Yes. We often dined together on evenings when we practised. Sir Richard was helping me perfect my interpretation of Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Fiendishly difficult piece." "And you were present when this violin supposedly played by itself?" A shadow crossed Winter's face. "Not supposedly, Mr. Holmes. I heard it clearly. Barrett and I both did. It was Sir Richard's newest composition, a piece he had played for me just last week, still unfinished then. But what we heard was the complete work, including passages I had never heard before." Holmes picked up one of the manuscript pages, studying it intently. "Could you identify which portions of this score were written most recently? The final additions, as it were?" Winters stepped forward, examining the pages with a professional eye. "These final 2 staves," he indicated with a long finger. "The development of the secondary theme. Sir Richard had been struggling with this section. He played several variations for me during our last lesson, dissatisfied with each. And the handwriting, is it consistent throughout?" The young musician hesitated. "It appears to be his hand, but—" He frowned. The later notations seem more hurried, perhaps. Sir Richard was usually meticulous in his manuscript preparation. Holmes produced his magnifying glass, bending close to the paper. "Indeed, most interesting." Our examination was interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished-looking gentleman whose resemblance to certain portraits in the hallway marked him unmistakably as Sir Richard's brother. "William Crandall," he introduced himself with a curt nod. "My sister-in-law is finally resting under sedation. What progress have you made in explaining these disturbing events?" "We have only just begun our investigation, Mr. Crandall," Lestrade responded. "Mr. Holmes has been engaged to assist." "Holmes?" The man's eyebrows rose. "I see Margaret has spared no expense, though I fail to understand what requires investigation. My brother died of natural causes. The physician was quite clear on that point. As for this nonsense about violins playing themselves, grief affects people in strange ways. You dismiss the testimony of 2 witnesses?" Holmes inquired mildly. "I dismiss superstition and hysteria. Barrett is devoted but aging, and young Winters, here," he cast a dismissive glance at the protégé, "has an artist's temperament. An overactive imagination is practically a professional requirement." Winters stiffened visibly, but remained silent. "Nevertheless," Holmes continued, "the violin was undeniably moved from its case to the stand. Unless you suggest both men are lying, I suggest nothing of the sort. Merely that there are rational explanations that don't involve the supernatural." "On that, Mr. Crandall, we are in complete agreement," Holmes replied with a thin smile. "Watson, I believe it's time we examined the late Sir Richard himself." Chapter 3. The Silent Composer. Sir Richard Crandall's bedchamber was a spacious room, dominated by a large 4-poster bed, where the musician's body now lay, covered with a fine linen sheet. The local physician, Dr. Morris, a portly, anxious man, with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, stood in attendance, clearly discomfited by the circumstances. "I've conducted only a preliminary examination," he informed us as Holmes approached the bed. Lady Crandall was insistent that her husband not be disturbed unnecessarily. "Understandable," Holmes replied, "but now quite unavoidable." With Betian, deft movements, he drew back the sheet to reveal the composer's face. Sir Richard had been a handsome man in his 50s, with strong features and a neatly trimmed silver beard. In death, his expression was peaceful, betraying no sign of distress or struggle. Holmes studied him intently, his eyes narrowing as he examined the musician's hands with particular care. "A callus on the left fingertips, common among violinists," he murmured. "But note the unusual development of the right thumb and forefinger, suggesting he composed extensively in longhand rather than at the piano, as many composers prefer." "That's significant," I asked. "Everything about a man's hands tells his story, Watson." Holmes carefully lifted the right hand, scrutinizing the fingernails. No ink stains, though he was supposedly writing when he died, and observe a slight discoloration around the lips, a faint bluish tinge. Dr. Morris peered over Holmes's shoulder. "I noted that as well, though I attributed it to the natural processes after death." "Perhaps," Holmes conceded, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You detected no odour when you examined him initially?" "Odour? No, nothing unusual." Holmes bent closer to the dead man's face, inhaling delicately. "Interesting. The brandy he consumed before death. Was the glass recovered? It should still be in the music room," Lestrade offered. "I instructed that nothing be removed." "Excellent." Holmes straightened, casting one final glance over the body before replacing the sheet. "Dr. Morris, when would you estimate Sir Richard's death occurred?" "Between 10 and 10:30, based on body temperature and rigor mortis." "And the supposed spectral performance?" "Shortly after midnight." Barrett answered from the doorway, where he had been waiting discreetly. Lady Crandall had just retired, having refused the doctor's sedative. "I was preparing the house for night when I heard it." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then let us return to the music room. I should like to examine a few more details before speaking with Lady Crandall." As we descended the grand staircase, I noticed a portrait of a striking woman in evening attire hanging prominently in the hall. "Sir Richard's first wife," Barrett explained, following my gaze. "Lady Eleanora. She passed away 7 years ago. Consumption." "And the current Lady Crandall?" Holmes inquired. "They married 3 years ago. Lady Margaret was a patron of the arts, 20 years his junior. Some thought it an unconventional match." William Crandall, who had followed us down, gave a derisive snort. "What Barrett means to say, Mr. Holmes, is that many believed Margaret Ashton married my brother for his fortune and reputation. Richard was besotted, blind to what everyone else could plainly see." "And what was that, precisely?" Holmes asked, pausing on the stairs. "That she had ambitions beyond being merely the wife of a celebrated musician. Margaret fancies herself a composer as well, though her talents are decidedly amateur. Richard indulged her pretensions, of course. You seem to hold your sister-in-law in rather low esteem, Mr. Crandall," I observed. He shrugged unapologetically. "I value honesty, Dr. Watson. My concerns about Margaret were vindicated when Richard began revising his will last month. Holmes's interest visibly sharpened." "Indeed? In what manner?" "He wouldn't discuss specifics, but he mentioned ensuring his musical legacy was properly preserved. I believe he intended to establish a foundation for promising young musicians." Crandall's eyes flickered toward Winters, who had emerged from the library, no doubt with his protégé as the primary beneficiary. Winters flushed at the implied criticism. "Sir Richard's generosity was legendary, but I never sought financial advantage from our association." "Yet you stand to gain considerably from his death, do you not?" Crandall challenged. "Your debut next season, endorsed by the Crandall name, will launch your career spectacularly, especially with the publicity of performing your late mentor's final composition." "Gentlemen," Holmes interjected smoothly, "fascinating as these family dynamics are, they must wait. The brandy glass, Lestrade. It requires immediate attention." Back in the music room, Holmes located the glass on a small side table near the writing desk. He examined it carefully, holding it up to the light before cautiously sniffing its contents. "As I suspected," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Watson, your medical opinion. What substances might produce a bluish discoloration of the lips without other obvious symptoms?" "Several possibilities," I replied. "Certain cyanotic compounds, some metallic poisons. Without further examination, yes, quite." Holmes carefully placed the glass in a handkerchief and handed it to Lestrade. "This should be analysed immediately." "Poison?" The inspector's voice dropped to a whisper. "Are you suggesting Sir Richard was murdered?" "I am suggesting nothing yet, merely exploring possibilities." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a woman whose commanding presence immediately drew all eyes. She was tall and elegant, dressed in a black morning gown that accentuated her pale complexion and striking auburn hair. Despite signs of recent weeping, she carried herself with remarkable composure. "Lady Crandall," Lestrade began, "I thought you were resting." "I found sleep impossible, Inspector," she replied in a cultured voice tinged with a slight Scottish accent. "Not with strangers prowling through my husband's personal belongings." Her gaze settled on Holmes. "You must be the famous detective my brother-in-law saw fit to mention. Have you found evidence of foul play, Mr. Holmes, or merely confirmation that my husband's heart failed him?" "My condolences on your loss, Lady Crandall," Holmes responded. "I've only begun my investigation." "An investigation I did not request," she noted coldly. "Yet one that circumstances demand," Holmes countered. "A locked room, a violin mysteriously relocated, music played without a musician. Surely you agree these events warrant explanation. Grief plays strange tricks on the mind, Mr. Holmes. James has served this household for 30 years. His devotion to Richard was absolute. As for Mr. Winters—" She glanced at the young violinist with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Artists perceive the world differently than ordinary mortals. And the completed composition? Holmes gestured toward the manuscript pages. "How do you account for that?" For the first time, Lady Crandall's composure wavered. "Richard often worked late into the night. He must have finished it before—" Her voice faltered momentarily. "Before he was taken from us." Holmes studied her intently. "Were you present during the evening's events, Lady Crandall?" "I dined with my husband, Mr. Winters, and William, who arrived unexpectedly. Afterward, I retired to the drawing-room while Richard and Frederick discussed musical matters. Richard sent for me around 10 o'clock, wishing to play a passage from his new work. I stayed perhaps 20 minutes before leaving him to his composition." "And you were where when Barrett discovered the body?" "In my sitting room, reading. I heard James cry out and came immediately." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Do your questions serve a purpose, Mr. Holmes, or are you merely satisfying your curiosity at my expense? I assure you, Lady Crandall, everything I ask has purpose." Holmes turned to the violin, studying it with renewed interest. "This Stradivarius, it was your husband's most prized possession?" "One of them, yes. A gift from his first wife's family. Eleanora's dowry, in essence. I see. And the composition he was working on, what was its significance?" Richard called it his legacy piece. He believed it would be remembered as his finest work. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He was right about that, at least. It will certainly be remembered now." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed it will, Lady Crandall. Indeed it will." Chapter 4. Discordant Notes. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 2 in the morning as Holmes conducted a meticulous examination of the music room. He moved with the focused intensity I had witnessed countless times, measuring distances between objects, studying the floor with his magnifying glass, and even testing the acoustics of the chamber by tapping various surfaces. "Lestrade," he said suddenly, "I should like to speak with the household staff, the housekeeper and the maid you mentioned." "At this hour?" William Crandall protested. "The servants are exhausted by the evening's events." "Murder waits for no one's convenience, Mr. Crandall," Holmes replied sharply. "Murder?" Lady Crandall's voice cut through the room like a knife. "You overstep, Mr. Holmes. The doctor clearly stated the doctor made a preliminary assessment based on incomplete information," Holmes countered. "The evidence increasingly suggests deliberate poisoning." Lestrade cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I've sent the brandy glass for analysis, but results won't be available until morning, by which time critical evidence may be lost." Holmes turned to Barrett. Please summon the housekeeper and maid. My questions won't take long." As Barrett departed, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the room. I observed the reactions of those present. Lady Crandall stood rigidly by the piano, her knuckles white where she gripped its polished surface. William Crandall paced by the window, his reflection fragmented in the fogged glass. And young Winters sat in a corner chair, his fingers unconsciously mimicking the movements of a violinist on an invisible instrument. "While we wait," Holmes continued, "perhaps Mr. Winters might satisfy my curiosity about this final composition. You mentioned Sir Richard had been struggling with certain passages." The young musician looked up, momentarily startled. "Yes, the development of the second theme. He found it elusive. We discussed several approaches just this week." "And what was the nature of this composition? Its structure, its emotional content?" "It was a sonata for solo violin, unconventional in form. Sir Richard called it Echoes of Mortality, a reflection on life's transience." Winter's voice softened with evident admiration. He spoke of capturing the conversation between the living and those who have passed. "There's a haunting dialogue throughout, as if two violins were playing, though it's written for just one." "Appropriate, considering recent events," William saw, muttered. Holmes ignored the interruption. "This composition, was it commissioned?" "No," Lady Crandall answered before Winters could respond. "It was a personal project. Something Richard began after visiting his first wife's grave on the anniversary of her death." "I see." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And your own compositions, Lady Crandall. Your brother-in-law mentioned you have musical aspirations as well." A flash of annoyance crossed her features. "Modest ones, yes. Richard encouraged my efforts, though William has always found them amusing." "Because Richard felt obligated to praise his wife's mediocre attempts," William said with undisguised contempt. "A courtesy that would have been unnecessary had you married him for love rather than advantage. How dare you?" Lady Crandall's composure fractured momentarily. "I endured your insinuations while Richard lived because he valued family harmony, but I will not tolerate them now." "Harmony!" William laughed bitterly. "There was precious little of that after you entered his life. Richard's final years should have been his most productive. Instead, Holmes interrupted firmly, "we find ourselves investigating his untimely death. A more productive avenue of inquiry, I think." The arrival of Mrs. Giles, the housekeeper, and Ellen, the maid, provided a timely interruption. Mrs. Giles was a stern-faced woman of about 60, with shrewd eyes that seemed to miss nothing, while Ellen was a nervous young woman who kept her gaze fixed on the floor. "Mrs. Giles," Holmes began, "I understand you've served the Crandall household for some time." 15 years, sir, since Lady Eleanora was still with us." "Then you're familiar with Sir Richard's habits. Did you notice anything unusual about his behaviour recently?" The housekeeper considered the question carefully. "He'd been more withdrawn these past few weeks, spending long hours in this room. And there were the arguments." "Arguments?" Lestrade prompted. "Between Sir Richard and Lady Crandall, about the will mostly." Mrs. Giles cast an apologetic glance toward her employer. "Begging your pardon, my lady," but the gentleman asked. Lady Crandall's lips thinned, but she said nothing. "What about the will?" Holmes asked. "Sir Richard intended to establish a music foundation," Mrs. Giles explained. "Lady Crandall felt the terms were overly generous to certain parties." All eyes turned briefly to Winters, who shifted uncomfortably. "And you, Ellen?" Holmes addressed the maid directly. "What did you observe?" The girl startled at being addressed. "Nothing much, sir. I only tend to the upstairs rooms. Yet you were present in the house this evening. Did you hear anything unusual after Sir Richard was discovered, before the violin played?" Ellen's eyes darted nervously to Lady Crandall before answering. "I was turning down the beds when Mr. Barrett found the master. Later, when everyone was upstairs, I came down to close the curtains in the drawing room. I thought I heard someone in the corridor outside the music room, but when I looked, there was no one." "What time was this?" "Just before midnight, sir. A few minutes before the music started." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Ellen. That will be all for now." After the servants withdrew, Holmes turned his attention to the writing desk where the completed manuscript lay. Curious that Sir Richard would compose a piece meditating on mortality so shortly before his own death. Richard had become increasingly preoccupied with his legacy, William explained. "Our father died suddenly at a similar age. I believe Richard sensed his time might be short." "Premonition, Mr. Crandall." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't have taken you for a believer in the supernatural. Not premonition, heredity. Heart troubles run in our family." "Yet your brother showed no previous symptoms, none that he mentioned to me." Holmes picked up the manuscript pages again, studying them with renewed interest. "Lady Crandall, was your husband in the habit of discussing his compositions with you?" "He shared everything with me, Mr. Holmes. We had no secrets." "Then perhaps you can explain why the handwriting in these final passages differs subtly from the earlier sections." A heavy silence fell over the room. Lady Crandall paled visibly, while Winters leaned forward with sudden interest. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she finally responded. "Richard's hand was sometimes unsteady when he worked late into the night." "Indeed." Holmes carefully placed the manuscript back on the desk. "One final question, if I may. The Stradivarius, I presume it's insured?" "Of course," William answered, "for a considerable sum. The instrument is nearly priceless, one of only a few dozen authenticated Stradivarius violins in existence." "And who stands to benefit from this insurance?" Lady Crandall hesitated. "As Richard's widow, I inherit his estate, including the violin." "But surely you don't think—" "I think," Holmes interrupted gently, "that it's been a long night for everyone. Watson and I shall return in the morning to continue our investigation. Lestrade, I suggest you leave an officer on guard, both in this room and with Sir Richard's body." As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused by the violin stand. "One question continues to trouble me. If we accept that someone entered this room after it was locked, a feat requiring either a key or exceptional lock-picking skills, why move the violin from its case to the stand? Why not simply play it within the case if the intention was to create the illusion of supernatural activity?" "Perhaps," I ventured, "because the effect would be more dramatic with the violin on its stand, as if Sir Richard himself had returned to play it. Or perhaps," Holmes replied thoughtfully, "because the violin itself contains a clue that someone desperately wants us to discover." Chapter 5. The widow's tale dawn had barely broken over London when Holmes roused me from a brief slumber. I found him already dressed, his eyes bright with the fervour that marked his deepest engagements with a case. 3 telegraph messages lay, open on the breakfast table. "You've been busy," I remarked, stifling a yawn. "There's no time to waste, Watson. I've made inquiries regarding our central characters." He gestured to the telegrams. Sir Richard's heart was sound. He underwent a thorough examination just last month. Frederick Winters studied in Vienna and was once engaged to a pianist who died under mysterious circumstances. And perhaps most significantly, Lady Margaret Crandall was born Margaret Ellsworth, daughter of a failed composer who took his own life after being accused of plagiarism. Holmes sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I've arranged for Professor Allen from the Royal Academy to examine Sir Richard's composition this morning. It may confirm whether the final passages were written by Sir Richard or another hand." At Belgrave Square, Lestrade met us at the door, his expression grave. "The laboratory has confirmed your suspicions, Mr. Holmes," he said without preamble. "Traces of digitalis were found in the brandy glass, a quantity sufficient to induce heart failure. As I suspected, a poison that mimics natural cardiac arrest, particularly clever if one knows the victim has a family history of heart trouble. Lady Crandall has requested to speak with you directly. Says there are matters she didn't feel comfortable discussing last night with others present. We found Lady Crandall in a small morning room. Unlike the previous night, she now showed visible signs of strain. Her eyes reddened, her hands restless in her lap. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she acknowledged our entrance. "Inspector Lestrade tells me you've uncovered evidence that my husband was murdered. The evidence does point in that direction," Holmes confirmed gently. "I understand there are matters you wish to discuss privately. Last night, with William present, I could not speak freely. My brother-in-law has always harboured resentment toward me, believing I sought only financial security and social position." "And was there any truth to this assessment?" Holmes asked directly. Lady Crandall gave a sad smile. "I won't pretend Richard's status was irrelevant. I was 32, unmarried with limited prospects, but our connection was genuine. He recognized something in me that others had missed." Her gaze grew distant. "My father was a composer, talented but unrecognized. His failure destroyed him. When Richard discovered my own modest compositions, he encouraged me where others had dismissed my efforts." "I sense there is more you wish to tell us," Holmes prompted. "Yes." She straightened, having come to a difficult decision. "Richard's will. William mentioned it last night, but not accurately. Richard wasn't merely establishing a foundation for young musicians. He was creating a trust for the posthumous publication of previously unperfected works, including several of my compositions that he had helped me revise. This would have established your reputation as a composer," I observed. "It would have vindicated my father's belief in my talents," she corrected. "A form of redemption for our family name. And how did Mr. Winters factor into these arrangements?" Holmes inquired. Frederick was to premiere several of these works, including Richard's final composition, a considerable honour that would advance his career. "You resented this decision, believed Richard was overly influenced by Frederick's talent. Their relationship had become intensely collaborative in recent months." "Collaborative?" Holmes prompted. "They would work together for hours. Frederick even contributed certain technical passages that Richard incorporated, a fact that Frederick was perhaps too eager to publicize. Tell me about the night of your husband's death. You mentioned retiring to your sitting room after briefly joining him in the music room. Did you see or hear anything unusual thereafter? She hesitated. I did return once more. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Richard had asked me to bring him a particular score from the library. He was alone then, working intently. That was the last time I saw him alive. Her voice trembled. I did notice his brandy glass had been refilled, though I hadn't seen Barrett. Bring it. And where were the others at this time? William was in the smoking room. Frederick had stepped out for air. He often walks when contemplating musical problems. The Stradivarius, it has significant sentimental value beyond its monetary worth. It was Richard's most treasured possession, Lady Crandall confirmed. A gift from Eleanora's family. But more than that, it was the instrument on which he had built his reputation. He often said it contained the essence of his musical soul. As we made our way to the music room, I noticed Holmes's expression had grown more intent. You've had an insight, I remarked. Several, though none yet conclusive. The case grows more intricate. Poisoned brandy, revised wills, artistic collaborations, and family legacies. He paused outside the door. Note that Lady Crandall made no mention of the violin playing after her husband's death. One might expect such an extraordinary event to feature prominently in her account. The Stradivarius rested on its stand, gleaming in the morning sunlight. Holmes approached it with reverence, carefully lifting it to examine its contours. A magnificent instrument, he murmured. Late 17th century, one of Stradivari's golden period pieces. His fingers traced the delicate F-holes and the elegant scroll. Then, unexpectedly, he raised it to his ear and gently shook it. Holmes, what? Are you? He silenced me with a gesture, then turned the violin over and examined its back with his magnifying glass. As I suspected, he whispered, Watson, observe here. A nearly invisible seam where none should exist. This violin has been modified, with a small compartment hollowed into the back panel. With delicate precision, he pressed a spot near the lower bout, and a small section of the wood shifted slightly. What have you found? Lestrade asked, entering the room. Holmes carefully extracted a folded paper from the hidden cavity. The reason. Our mysterious musician needed the violin on its stand rather than in its case, he replied, unfolding the document. And perhaps the answer to the riddle of Sir Richard's death. Chapter 6. The Composer's Secret. The document Holmes extracted from the violin's hidden compartment was a single sheet of high-quality paper, folded several times to fit the small space. As he carefully opened it, I observed that it contained musical notation, a short passage of perhaps a dozen measures, along with a brief message written in a cramped, hurried hand. What does it say? Lestrade asked, peering over Holmes's shoulder. Holmes read aloud. Should anything happen to me, this proves all. The melody tells what words cannot. E.C. He examined the signature carefully. E.C., not Richard Crandall's initials. Eleanora Crandall, I suggested. His first wife? Precisely, Watson. And the date? Holmes indicated a small notation. In the corner is from 7 years ago, shortly before her death. "But what does it mean?" Lestrade pressed. "How could a musical passage prove anything?" "That," Holmes replied, "is what we must determine." He turned as footsteps approached the doorway. William Crandall entered, followed closely by Frederick Winters. Both men stopped short at the tableau before them, Holmes holding the mysterious document, Lestrade's evident confusion, and my own undoubtedly perplexed expression. "What's happening here?" William demanded. "What have you found?" Holmes folded the paper carefully. "A message, Mr. Crandall, hidden inside your brother's violin. A message from his first wife." William's face paled visibly. "That's impossible. Eleonora has been dead for years, yet she left something behind, something she believed might be needed should anything happen to her." Holmes's keen eyes studied both men's reactions. "Mr. Winters, as a violinist, perhaps you might assist us. This musical passage—" He held out the paper. "Would you be able to play it?" The young musician approached with evident curiosity, taking the sheet with professional reverence. His eyes widened slightly as he scanned the notation. "This is unusual. The phrasing is unconventional." He studied it a moment longer. "But yes, I could play it." "Then I would ask you to do so. On this violin, if you please." A strange tension filled the room as Winters gingerly lifted the Stradivarius. He positioned it beneath his chin with the practised ease of a professional, then hesitated, bow poised above the strings. "This melody, it resembles a motif from Sir Richard's final composition." "Indeed?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "How fascinating! Please proceed." Winters drew the bow across the strings, and a haunting melody filled the music room, spare and melancholy, with an unsettling quality that seemed to hang in the air even after the final note faded. The passage was brief, perhaps 30 seconds in duration, but its effect was profound. I noticed William Crandall's hand tighten on the back of a chair until his knuckles whitened. "Thank you, Mr. Winters," Holmes said quietly. "Most illuminating." Don't understand the significance," Lestrade confessed. "Nor do I, fully," Holmes admitted. "But I believe Professor Allen may assist us when he arrives. In the meantime—" He was interrupted by Barrett, who appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Holmes, there is a Professor Allen here to see you. And Lady, Crandall asks if you've concluded your examination of the violin." "Excellent timing. Please show the Professor in, and inform Lady Crandall that we shall return the instrument shortly." Professor Allen proved to be a tall, stooped man, with the distracted air of one whose mind perpetually dwells on matters beyond immediate surroundings. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted, with a nod. "I've brought the manuscript as requested." "Thank you, Professor. I wonder if you might give us your expert opinion." Holmes indicated the paper from the violin. "This musical passage, how does it relate to Sir Richard's final composition?" 2. Professor examined both documents side by side, humming softly to himself. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "This shorter passage appears as a central motif in the larger work, though with subtle variations. It's the foundation of the entire composition, what we call the generative theme." "So Sir Richard borrowed this melody for his final work," Lestrade suggested. "Not borrowed," Holmes corrected. "Completed. This fragment was Eleanora's composition, her own musical signature, if you will. Sir Richard built his final masterpiece around his dead wife's unfinished work. William Crandall made a sound that might have been a stifled objection. Holmes turned to him with a penetrating gaze. "You recognized the melody when Mr. Winters played it, didn't you, Mr. Crandall? You knew its significance immediately." William hesitated, then gave a short nod. Eleanora was working on a composition before her death, something she kept mostly private. Richard was devastated when she died before completing it. And yet, Holmes continued, Sir Richard never published this fragment or acknowledged its source in his new composition. Curious, wouldn't you say, Professor Allen? Most unusual, the professor agreed. Sir Richard was scrupulous about attribution throughout his career. To incorporate another's work without acknowledgement would be entirely out of character. Unless, Holmes suggested softly, the acknowledgement exists in the composition itself, a musical confession hidden in plain hearing. Frederick Winters had been examining the manuscript with increasing agitation. "This final section," he said suddenly, "the one Sir Richard struggled with. It's a deliberate counterpoint to the original theme, a musical dialogue between two distinct voices." "Between the living and the dead," I murmured, recalling Winters's earlier description of the piece. "Yes." Winters's eyes lit with understanding. That's what he meant. He was literally incorporating Eleanora's voice into the composition, letting her speak through the music. Lady Crandall appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of controlled tension. "What is this about Eleanora's voice? What have you found?" Holmes regarded her carefully. "Evidence, Lady Crandall, that your husband's final composition was built upon a theme created by his first wife, a theme he kept hidden inside her violin all these years." "That's absurd," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Richard would have told me, would he?" Holmes moved toward her with measured steps. If he believed Eleanora's death was not the result of natural illness, if he suspected she had been, in fact, murdered. A collective gasp filled the room. William Crandall stepped forward. "Holmes, this is outrageous speculation. My sister-in-law died of consumption. A tragic but well-documented case. Did she?" Holmes countered. "The note accompanying this musical fragment suggests otherwise. Should anything happen to me, this proves all." What was Eleanora Crandall afraid might happen to her? What did she believe this melody would prove? Lady Crandall had grown deathly pale. "This is monstrous. Richard never suggested, didn't he?" Holmes interrupted gently. "Perhaps not in words, but in his final composition, his legacy piece, he created a musical testimony, a piece that would reveal the truth once completed." He turned to Frederick Winters. "Which is why the violin needed to be played that night, after Sir Richard's death. Someone needed to ensure the composition was found complete, the message delivered." Winters took an involuntary step backward. "I don't know what you're implying." "I believe you do, Mr. Winters." Holmes's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath the calm. "The question remains, who played the violin that night, and who ensured Sir Richard would never finish revealing the truth himself?" Chapter 7. Confessions and confrontations. Frederick Winters' face had drained of colour as Holmes's accusation hung in the air. The young violinist's fingers twitched nervously at his sides, as if seeking the comfort of an instrument. "Mr. Holmes," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "you cannot possibly believe that you played the violin after Sir Richard's death." Holmes finished for him. "On the contrary, I'm quite certain of it. The question is why, and at whose behest?" William Crandall stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "This is preposterous. You're suggesting that Eleanora was murdered 7 years ago, and that Richard was killed to prevent him from revealing this supposed crime through a musical composition. Have you taken leave of your senses?" Holmes remained unperturbed. "Art often reveals what words conceal, Mr. Crandall. Your brother was a man who lived through his music. It served as his most honest form of expression." He turned back to Winters. "I believe you recognized what Sir Richard was doing with this composition. You understood the musical language he was employing to tell a story that had remained hidden for years." Winters swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Holmes and the other occupants of the room. I did notice something unusual in his approach to this piece. It contained musical phrases that seemed to be in conversation with each other. 2 distinct voices engaged in what felt like a debate or confession. And did Sir Richard explain the significance of this technique? Holmes pressed. Not explicitly. He spoke of it as a dialogue between the present and the past, between memory and reality. Winters hesitated, then continued with evident reluctance. 2 nights ago, he asked me to study the composition in its entirety, the first time he had shared the complete work, though it was still unfinished. He said I might soon need to understand it fully, as it contained a truth that would eventually demand recognition. Lady Crandall, who had been standing rigid by the doorway, stepped into the room. "Are you suggesting my husband suspected he might be killed? That he entrusted his suspicions to his protégé rather than to me, his wife?" "Or to the authorities," Lestrade added with a frown. "Sir Richard was a methodical man," Holmes replied. "I believe he wanted irrefutable evidence before making such extraordinary claims. The composition was to be that evidence, a musical testimony constructed in such a way that only those with the knowledge to interpret it would understand its message." "And that message concerned my sister-in-law's death?" William demanded. "Richard never once suggested Eleanora died of anything but consumption. He mourned her deeply, yes, but he accepted the medical diagnosis. Did he?" Holmes's expression was sceptical, or did he harbour doubts that grew over time, particularly as he delved into her unfinished work? Music can reveal the composer's state of mind, can it not, Professor Allen? The professor, who had been silently following the exchange, nodded, thoughtfully. Indeed. A close analysis of compositional choices can reveal psychological undercurrents the composer might not even consciously recognize. It's especially telling when a composer's style undergoes significant transformation. As Sir Richard's did following his first wife's death, Holmes noted. According to the musical journals I consulted this morning, critics observed a marked shift in his compositions after Eleanora's passing, darker tonalities, more complex harmonies suggesting unresolved tension. "Grief changes a man," William said dismissively. "As does guilt," Holmes countered, "or the suspicion that one has failed to protect someone beloved." "This is all fascinating speculation," Lady Crandall interjected, her voice brittle, "but it fails to explain why my husband was poisoned yesterday, or who played his violin after his death." "And on the contrary," Holmes replied, "it explains both. Sir Richard was killed because he was on the verge of revealing a 7-year-old murder through his final composition. As for who played the violin—" He turned again to Winters. "Your performance earlier was quite illuminating. You have an exceptional ear, Mr. Winters, and a distinctive bowing technique I observed while you played Eleanora's fragment, a technique that would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with your style." Winters paled further. "I don't understand what you're implying." "I believe you do. Barrett and you claimed to hear the violin playing, yet entered the room only after the music had ceased. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Especially as you possess the technical skill to play a complex piece in near darkness, having rehearsed it extensively with Sir Richard." "You think I fabricated the ghostly performance?" Winter's voice rose in indignation. "To what possible end?" "To ensure that Sir Richard's final message would be delivered," Holmes answered calmly. "To honour your mentor's wish that the truth be revealed, even after his death. You played the violin, Mr. Winters, and then placed it on its stand rather than returning it to its case, a subtle but deliberate staging meant to draw attention to the instrument itself." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the young musician. His shoulders slumped slightly, the posture of a man relinquishing a heavy burden. "Yes," he admitted softly, "I played the violin that night, but not to deceive, to fulfill a promise." "Explain yourself," Lestrade demanded. "2 days ago, Sir Richard showed me the hidden compartment in the Stradivarius and the fragment of Eleanora's composition. He told me he had recently discovered evidence suggesting her death was not from natural causes. He had incorporated her musical fragment into his new composition as a way of bringing her voice back from silence. He called it her testimony from beyond the grave. "And what was this evidence?" Holmes asked. He wouldn't say precisely, only that it involved a particular medication Eleanora had been taking during her illness, a preparation that should have alleviated her symptoms, but instead seemed to accelerate her decline. He had recently consulted a specialist in Vienna who confirmed his suspicions. A sharp intake of breath from William Crandall drew our attention. His face had grown ashen. "Richard never mentioned any such concerns to me," he said, his voice strained. "He made me promise," Winters continued, "that if anything happened to him before the composition's premiere, I would ensure it was found complete, with Eleanora's theme prominently featured. When he died so suddenly, I kept my word. I entered the music room using the spare key from his study, played the completed composition on the Stradivarius, and then replaced the violin on its stand as a signal." "A signal to whom?" Holmes pressed. Winter's gaze shifted momentarily to Lady Crandall, to anyone who might understand its significance. "You expect us to believe this fantastical tale?" William scoffed. "That you broke into a locked room in the dead of night out of some misguided loyalty?" "I believe him," Holmes stated flatly, "though I suspect he hasn't told us everything yet." His penetrating gaze remained fixed on the young musician. "You knew who poisoned Sir Richard, didn't you? You saw something that night, something that confirmed your suspicions even before your mentor's sudden death." Winter's face crumpled with evident anguish. I wasn't certain. I still am not, but I saw His confession was cut short by the sudden crack of a gunshot, followed immediately by the shattering of the window behind him. "Down!" Holmes shouted, lunging forward to pull Winters to the floor, as a second shot splintered the frame of the violin stand. Lestrade and I dropped instinctively, while William and Lady Crandall froze in shock before Barrett rushed forward to pull them away from the windows. "The garden!" Holmes hissed. "Watson, your revolver!" I retrieved my service revolver from my coat pocket as Holmes crawled rapidly to the shattered window, keeping below the sill. Peering cautiously out, I glimpsed a figure in dark clothing disappearing into the shrubbery at the far end of the garden. "Lestrade," Holmes called. "The side gate. They'll exit to the mews behind the square." The inspector was already moving, rushing from the room with commendable speed. Holmes turned to where Winters lay pale and shaking on the floor. "It appears, Mr. Winters," he said grimly, "that someone is most eager to prevent you from completing your testimony." Chapter 8. Pursuit and revelation. Chaos ensued in the moments following the gunshots. Holmes directed Barrett to secure the doors, while I attended to Winters, who had sustained a minor graze to his shoulder from flying glass. Lady Crandall, ashen-faced, was guided to a chair by Professor Allen, while William Crandall stood frozen by the doorway, his expression one of stunned disbelief. "Watson," Holmes called sharply, "stay with Winters. Don't let him out of your sight." With that, he vaulted nimbly through the shattered window into the garden, in pursuit of the would-be assassin. I positioned myself beside the young violinist, revolver at the ready, as Barrett returned with clean cloths to staunch the bleeding from Winters's shoulder. "It's only superficial," I assured him, examining the wound. "The glass, not the bullet, caught you." "Who would—" Winters began, his voice shaking. "Someone who fears what you know," I replied grimly. "What were you about to tell us before the shots were fired?" Winters glanced nervously around the room. I'm not certain any more. Perhaps I was mistaken." Lady Crandall rose unsteadily from her chair. "This is madness. First, my husband is poisoned, now someone fires shots into my home. I insist we summon additional police immediately." "Inspector Lestrade is in pursuit," I reminded her. And Holmes?" "Holmes is one man, as is Lestrade," she retorted. "Meanwhile, a killer roams free." Her gaze fell upon Winters, hardening slightly. "If you know something that might end this nightmare, Mr. Winters, I implore you to speak plainly." Before Winters could respond, we heard the front door slam and footsteps racing toward the music room. Holmes appeared in the doorway, breathing heavily, his coat torn at the sleeve. "He escaped," he announced tersely. "A carriage was waiting. In the mews, clearly planned in advance. Lestrade is organizing roadblocks, but I fear they'll be too late." "Did you see him clearly?" I asked. "Only a glimpse. Tall, slender, wearing a dark coat and hat pulled low." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room. "Everyone appears remarkably calm, considering someone just attempted murder in this household." "We are English, Mr. Holmes," William Crandall said stiffly. "We do not succumb to hysterics, even in extraordinary circumstances." Indeed, Holmes approached Winters, who was now sitting up, the bleeding from his shoulder wound contained. "You were about to make a revelation, Mr. Winters. Perhaps now would be an opportune moment to continue." The young musician swallowed hard. I said, "I may have been mistaken." "Someone thought your words worth killing for," Holmes interrupted sharply. "Mistakes rarely warrant such extreme measures." Winters closed his eyes briefly, then spoke with evident reluctance. "The night Sir Richard died, I left the dining room after our meal to take some air in the garden, a habit of mine when working through musical problems. As I was returning through the side entrance, I saw someone exit the music room in obvious haste. It was just for a moment, and the corridor was dimly lit." "Who did you see?" Holmes pressed. Winter's gaze darted to Lady Crandall, then away. It was Mrs. Giles, the housekeeper. She appeared flustered and was carrying something small in her handkerchief. I thought little of it at the time. Servants often move about the house attending to their duties. It was only after Sir Richard was found that I began to wonder. "Mrs. Giles?" Lady Crandall exclaimed. "That's absurd. She's been with the household for 15 years. She adored Richard." "Indeed she did," Holmes murmured thoughtfully, "which makes her an unlikely suspect for his murder, but perhaps not for another role in this affair." He turned to Barrett. "Where is Mrs. Giles now?" "In her quarters, I believe, sir. She was quite shaken by the events of last night. Fetch her, if you would, and perhaps it would be wise for a constable to accompany you." As Barrett departed, Holmes paced the room with measured steps. "The pieces are beginning to align," he said, almost to himself. "Sir Richard discovers evidence suggesting his first wife was murdered. He encodes this revelation in his final composition, using Eleanora's own musical theme as testimony. Then, before he can complete this work, he himself is poisoned. But by whom, I asked, and to what purpose after 7 years? That, Watson, is the heart of our mystery." Holmes paused before the shattered window, gazing out into the garden. "Consider, who benefits most from Sir Richard's death? Who might have had reason to silence Eleanora Crandall 7 years ago, and who would go to such lengths to prevent Mr. Winters from revealing what he witnessed?" A tense silence fell over the room, broken only when Barrett returned alone, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Giles is gone, sir. Her room has been hastily cleared of personal belongings. The constable is searching the servants' quarters now, but it appears she left some time ago." "How convenient," Holmes remarked dryly. "It seems our housekeeper anticipated our interest in her activities. You cannot seriously believe that Mrs. Giles killed my husband." Lady Crandall's voice wavered between incredulity and distress. "I believe she played a role," Holmes replied carefully, "though whether as principal or accomplice remains to be determined." "And the shots fired just now?" William Crandall demanded. "Are we to believe an elderly housekeeper scaled the garden wall with a revolver?" "Certainly not." Holmes agreed. "Mrs. Giles had an ally, someone with much more at stake, someone who has orchestrated these events from the beginning." His gaze swept the room, landing finally on the Stradivarius, still on its stand despite the chaos. The violin that played after death has more secrets to reveal, I think. And I believe I now know who played the composition that completed Sir Richard's testimony, and why his first wife's murder had to remain hidden, whatever the cost. Chapter 9. The widow's Ariel Lestrade returned shortly after, his face flushed with exertion and frustration. "Lost him," he announced grimly. "The carriage split from its driver near Sloane Square. Clearly planned. We've officers searching, but in this fog—" He gestured helplessly. "No matter," Holmes replied with surprising equanimity. "Our quarry will reveal themselves soon enough." He turned to Professor Allen, who had been quietly observing the proceedings. "Professor, I should like your expert opinion on one final matter. The musical fragment hidden in the violin, could it be considered valuable in its own right?" The professor adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. "Certainly. Any unpublished work by a composer of Eleanora Crandall's caliber would be of significant academic interest. She was considered exceptionally promising before her untimely death, perhaps even more naturally gifted than Sir Richard himself, though less prolific." "How interesting," Holmes murmured. "And the completed composition that incorporates this fragment, would you consider it a collaboration between husband and wife?" "Undoubtedly," the professor nodded. "A most unusual posthumous partnership. But the integration of her theme is so fundamental to the structure that it could rightfully bear both their names." Lady Crandall, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes? That my husband's murderer sought to steal Eleanora's musical legacy? That seems a trivial motive for such violence." "Nothing about art is trivial to those who dedicate their lives to it," Holmes replied. "Careers, reputations, and fortunes have been built on less." He moved to stand before the fireplace, his tall figure silhouetted against the flames. "Consider the facts. Eleanora Crandall dies of apparent consumption, leaving behind an unfinished musical fragment hidden in her violin, a hiding place suggesting she feared it might be taken from her. 7 years later, Sir Richard incorporates this fragment into what he believes will be his masterpiece, effectively sharing credit with his deceased wife." "And someone objected to this arrangement strongly enough to poison him?" I asked. "Indeed, Watson. Someone who had a vested interest in ensuring Eleanora's contribution remained anonymous. Someone who had perhaps benefited from her silence for many years." Holmes's gaze swept across the room, lingering momentarily on each face. "Lady Crandall, you mentioned your father was a composer who took his life after being accused of plagiarism. What was his name?" She stiffened visibly. "Edward Ellsworth. But I fail to see the relevance." "Edward Ellsworth," Holmes repeated. "E.E., not the initials on our hidden manuscript. The paper bears E.C., which could stand for Eleanora Crandall, or Eleanora Chapman, her maiden name." William Crandall started. "How could you possibly know?" "A simple matter of research," Holmes replied. "The marriage announcement in the Times archives mentioned she was the daughter of George Chapman, a music publisher. Now, let us consider another curious fact. Lady Crandall, you have aspirations as a composer, yet your work has never achieved recognition. Sir Richard encouraged your efforts, despite your brother-in-law's dismissive attitude." Lady Crandall's chin lifted defiantly. "My husband recognized talent where others did not." "Or perhaps," Holmes suggested softly, "he recognized something else entirely. Professor Allen, were you familiar with Edward Ellsworth's compositions?" The professor frowned. "Only by reputation. His later works showed promise, but then came the accusations that he had stolen melodies from a student. He never published again after the scandal." "A ruinous allegation for a composer," Holmes noted. "Now, Imagine if that student had been Eleanor Chapman, before her marriage to Sir Richard. Imagine if her distinctive musical voice had been appropriated by her teacher, your father, Lady Crandall. A terrible silence fell over the room. Lady Crandall's face had gone deathly white, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "This is absurd," she finally whispered. "You cannot possibly—" "When Sir Richard married you," Holmes continued relentlessly, "did he know of your connection to his first wife? Did he recognize in your compositions echoes of Eleanor's distinctive style? Perhaps that was what drew him to you initially, the ghostly resemblance to his beloved first wife's musical voice." William Crandall had been watching his sister-in-law with growing horror. "Margaret, what is he saying?" Lady Crandall rose unsteadily to her feet. "He is saying nothing of consequence, merely spinning fantastical theories without proof." "There is proof," Holmes countered. "In the violin, in the composition, and in Mrs. Giles's hasty departure. She was your agent, was she not? First in Eleanor's household, perhaps administering medications that hastened rather than helped, and then in your own marriage to Sir Richard, where she could monitor his activities and report his discoveries." "You go too far, Mr. Holmes." Lady Crandall's voice had hardened. All pretense of grief suddenly vanished. "These wild accusations are supported by evidence." Holmes finished for her. "Sir Richard discovered the truth about your father's plagiarism from Eleanora, about the musical theft that drove him to suicide. He realized that you had married him not for love, nor even for his fortune, but to ensure Eleanor's most valuable composition would never see light. When he began incorporating her theme into his new work, effectively revealing her authorship to the world, you realized your family's shame would be exposed." Frederick Winters had been following this exchange with mounting agitation. "The brandy," he said suddenly. "When I glimpsed Mrs. Giles leaving the music room, she must have just administered the poison." Lady Crandall's composure cracked entirely. "Stupid, interfering boy," she hissed. "Always watching, always hovering at Richard's shoulder. He should never have shown you that cursed melody." "So you admit it." Lestrade stepped forward, his hand moving toward his coat pocket. "I admit nothing," she replied, her voice suddenly calm again. "Mr. Holmes spins an entertaining tale, but it remains just that, a tale. There is no evidence connecting me to any crime. There is the testimony of the violin," Holmes said quietly, "and the testimony of the one who played it after your husband's death. Not Mr. Winters, as I initially believed, but you, Lady Crandall." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Me? That's preposterous." "Is it? You are a trained musician, certainly capable of playing the piece. And who else could have entered the locked music room without arousing suspicion? You needed the composition found complete, but with your own alterations, your own ending, that would obscure Eleanor's original theme rather than emphasize it." For a moment, Lady Crandall stood perfectly still, her face unreadable. Then, with startling swiftness, she reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a small revolver. "Step back, all of you," she commanded, her voice now devoid of its earlier refinement. "Not another word, Mr. Holmes, unless you wish to join my husband in death." Chapter 10. The Final Movement. The music room fell silent save for the ticking of the mantel clock as Lady Crandall's revolver gleamed in the firelight. My own weapon remained in my pocket, rendered useless by her vigilant attention. Lestrade had frozen mid-step, his experienced eye assessing the grave danger of our situation. "Margaret," William Crandall spoke with genuine bewilderment, "have you taken leave of your senses? Put that thing down before someone is hurt." "Silence," she snapped. Her aristocratic demeanour entirely vanished. "You never saw past your prejudices, William, always so certain I married Richard for his money and position. You never once considered I might have deeper motives. Revenge," Holmes supplied calmly, seemingly unperturbed by the weapon aimed at his chest. "A dish best served cold, they say, and 7 years is certainly that." A bitter smile twisted Lady Crandall's lips. "Not revenge, Mr. Holmes. Justice. Eleanora Chapman stole my father's music, not the other way around. She was a mediocre talent who seduced my father into teaching her, then claimed his best melodies as her own. When confronted, she wove a convincing tale of theft that destroyed him." "And so you destroyed her in turn," Holmes concluded, "a slow poisoning disguised as consumption." "She deserved worse," Lady Crandall hissed. "My father was a genius whose name might have echoed through concert halls for generations. Instead, he died in obscurity and shame while she built her reputation on his stolen work." "But Sir Richard knew nothing of this when he married you," Holmes prompted, his voice level as he imperceptibly shifted his position, drawing her attention fully to himself and away from the others. "No, I sought him out deliberately after Eleanora's death, the great Sir Richard Crandall in the depths of mourning for his sainted wife." Her voice dripped with contempt. He was pathetically eager for comfort, for someone who appreciated music as she had. I played the devoted admirer, the aspiring composer seeking guidance. He never suspected my true purpose. "Which was?" Holmes inquired, though his expression suggested he had already deduced the answer. "To ensure Eleanora's theft remained buried forever. The fragment she hid, her supposed masterpiece, was my father's work, the very melody she had stolen. When she realized I had discovered her secret, she hid it in that damnable violin. I searched for it after her death, but never found it, until Sir Richard discovered it himself," Holmes added, "and began incorporating it into his final composition, unknowingly exposing your father's melody to the world under Eleanora's name. Hitiway was besotted with her memory." Lady Crandall spat. "Even after years of marriage to me, he worshipped at the altar of Saint Eleanora. When he found that fragment, he believed he'd discovered her unfinished masterwork. He spoke of it as their final collaboration, her theme, his development, a testimony to their perfect musical union." Her hand trembled slightly, causing the revolver to waver. He couldn't be allowed to complete it. Winters, who had remained silent until now, spoke with quiet intensity. "So you poisoned him, and then played his violin yourself, pretending to complete the composition according to your own design." "A simple matter to add digitalis to his brandy," she acknowledged with chilling detachment. "As for the composition, I needed it found, but with my alterations, changes that would mask the distinctive qualities of the original theme, burying it within conventional harmonies that critics would dismiss as pedestrian. Yet you couldn't destroy the original fragment," Holmes noted. "It remained hidden in the violin, waiting to be discovered." "A oversight I intended to correct once the household was asleep," she admitted, "but your arrival complicated matters." William Crandall had sunk into a chair, his face ashen. My brother? For a musical fragment? For my father's legacy? Lady Crandall's voice rose with sudden passion. For the truth. Richard would have exposed Eleanora's theft through his composition, don't you understand? He would have revealed her fraud while thinking he honoured her memory. A tragedy of errors, Holmes said softly, for I suspect there was no theft at all, merely a teacher recognizing his student had surpassed him. "You know nothing of it," she snarled. "I know that genuine musical innovation is unmistakable," Holmes countered. Professor Allen recognized the fragment's brilliance immediately, as did Sir Richard. Your father's downfall came not from Eleanora's accusation, but from his inability to produce work of similar quality thereafter. The evidence was in his subsequent compositions, your compositions, which Sir Richard encouraged out of kindness, while recognizing they lacked the spark of originality. Lady Crandall's face contorted with fury. "You will not speak another word!" she hissed, her finger tightening on the trigger. In that crucial moment, several things happened at once. The door behind her burst open as Barrett returned with a police constable, momentarily distracting her. Holmes seized the opportunity to lunge forward, while I simultaneously drew my revolver. William Crandall, nearest to his sister-in-law, acted with unexpected swiftness, grasping her wrist and forcing the weapon upward. A shot discharged into the ceiling, sending plaster dust raining down upon us as Holmes wrestled the revolver from her grasp. "Margaret Crandall," Lestrade announced with grim satisfaction as the constable rushed forward with handcuffs. "I arrest you for the murder of Sir Richard Crandall, and on suspicion of the murder of Lady Eleanora Crandall 7 years ago." As she was led away, her composure shattered entirely. "You understand nothing," she cried. "That melody was my birthright. She stole my father's genius, and Richard would have enshrined her theft for all time." When silence finally returned to the music room, Holmes approached the Stradivarius with reverent care. "The violin that played after death," he murmured, "has indeed revealed its secrets, though not as anyone expected." "A magnificent instrument," William Crandall said quietly, "tainted now by association with these terrible events." On the contrary, Holmes replied, "It has served as the vessel of truth, exactly as Eleanora intended when she hid her composition within it. The violin has not been tainted, but vindicated, as has your brother's musical judgment." "What will happen to the composition?" Winters asked, his face still pale from the ordeal. "That, young man, may depend partly on you," Holmes answered. "As Sir Richard's protégé, you are uniquely positioned to ensure his final work is performed, as he intended, with full acknowledgment of Eleanora's contribution." "It would be my honour," Winters said solemnly, "though I confess I'm uncertain which version represents Sir Richard's true intentions, the one I rehearsed with him, or the one played after his death. I believe Professor Allen may assist in that determination," Holmes suggested. "The musical language of the original fragment should indicate which development maintains its integrity." As Lestrade departed to oversee Lady Crandall's transportation to Scotland Yard, Holmes turned to William Crandall. "Your intervention was both timely and courageous, sir. I believe your brother would have been proud." William nodded grimly. "I only wish I had seen through her deception earlier. Perhaps Richard might still be alive. She played her role with consummate skill, Holmes assured him. Even I did not fully assemble the pattern until Mr. Winters revealed what he had witnessed the night of your brother's death. And Mrs. Giles, I inquired, will she be apprehended? Undoubtedly, Holmes replied with confidence. Lestrade's men are already searching her known associates. As Lady Crandall's accomplice in 2 murders, she will find no refuge in London. Frederick Winters approached the violin stand, looking down at the Stradivarius with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. It seems almost alive, he remarked softly, as if it truly did speak for the dead. In a way it did, Holmes agreed. For what is music but the voice of those who create it, preserved long after they have departed? Sir Richard understood this. When he incorporated Eleanora's theme into his final work, he was quite literally allowing her to speak again through his music. Chapter 11. Resonant Echoes. A fortnight had passed since the dramatic events at Belgrave Square. The newspapers had feasted upon the scandal. A celebrated musician poisoned by his own wife, a 7-year-old murder brought to light, all connected by a hidden musical fragment and a violin that had seemingly played itself. Holmes, as was his custom, had avoided the ensuing publicity, retreating to Baker Street to immerse himself in chemical experiments while the judicial process took its course. On this particular evening, we sat before our fire, as rain lashed against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop to our conversation. Holmes had been silent for much of the day, his mind seemingly engaged with matters far removed from our recent adventure, when a telegram arrived that roused him from his contemplation. From Lestrade, he announced, scanning the message. Mrs. Giles has been apprehended in Dover, attempting to secure passage to the continent. She has apparently made a full confession, confirming Lady Crandall's involvement in both murders. Justice served, then, I remarked, though I confess I still find aspects of the case perplexing. Such as, Holmes inquired, setting aside the telegram and reaching for his pipe. The musical fragment itself. If it was truly as brilliant as Professor Allen suggested, how could there be any confusion about its authorship? Surely Eleanora's distinctive style would have been evident to knowledgeable musicians. Holmes nodded approvingly. An excellent question, Watson. The answer lies in the nature of influence between teacher and student. Edward Ellsworth was undoubtedly talented. One doesn't become a respected composer otherwise. Eleanora, as his pupil, would naturally have absorbed elements of his style. When she began to develop her own voice, there would inevitably be similarities, passages that might be attributed to either composer. Then how can we be certain Lady Crandall was wrong? Perhaps her father was indeed plagiarized. We can't be absolutely certain, Holmes admitted, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Professor Allen has since examined Ellsworth's published compositions and compared them with Eleanora's known works. His conclusion is that while they share certain characteristics, Eleanora's music demonstrates innovations that Ellsworth's later compositions conspicuously lack. If he were truly the originator of her musical ideas, one would expect to find similar innovations throughout his own work. A tragedy compounded by misunderstanding, then, I mused. Lady Crandall genuinely believed she was avenging her father. Indeed, and therein lies the greatest danger, absolute conviction in one's own righteousness. Lady Crandall constructed an elaborate justification for murder based on her perception of events, a perception inevitably coloured by filial devotion. Our conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson announcing the arrival of Frederick Winters. The young violinist entered our sitting room with a new confidence in his bearing, though the events of Belgrave Square had left their mark in a seriousness beyond his years. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us warmly. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to personally deliver this." He handed Holmes an elegantly printed invitation. The premiere of Sir Richard's final composition will take place next month at St. James's Hall. After much consultation with Professor Allen, we've titled it Dialogues with the Departed, a posthumous collaboration between Sir Richard and Lady Deshille. Eleanora Crandall. Holmes examined the invitation with evident satisfaction, a fitting tribute to both composers, and the violin fragment. Incorporated exactly as Sir Richard intended, Winters confirmed. Professor Allen was able to distinguish between Sir Richard's original development and Lady Crandall's alterations through careful analysis of the harmonic structure. The result is, he paused, searching for words, extraordinary. A genuine musical conversation between two distinct voices, yet unified in purpose. "And the Stradivarius?" I inquired. "Will you be performing on it?" A shadow passed over Winter's face. "That was my initial intention, but William Crandall has made a more appropriate decision. The instrument is being donated to the Royal Academy of Music, where it will be displayed with a plaque honouring both Sir Richard and Lady Eleanora. I'll use my own violin for the performance." "A wise choice," Holmes nodded. "Some instruments carry too much history to serve as mere tools. The Stradivarius has earned its retirement, having fulfilled its purpose as both instrument and witness." Winters hesitated, then spoke with evident emotion. "I've been tormented by one question, Mr. Holmes. Could I have prevented Sir Richard's death if I had spoken immediately about seeing Mrs. Giles leave the music room?" "You must not blame yourself," Holmes said firmly. "Lady Crandall was determined and resourceful. Had that attempt failed, she would have found another opportunity. The true failure was Sir Richard's, not a moral failure, but one of perception. He never recognized the depth of his wife's resentment, even as he unknowingly provoked it by embracing Eleanora's musical legacy. "There is something else you should know," Winters added. "In preparing for the premiere, I've been granted access to Sir Richard's private papers. Among them, I found notes suggesting he had indeed begun to suspect his first wife's death was unnatural. He had consulted with several medical specialists about the progression of her illness, comparing it with typical consumption cases. Yet, he never took his suspicions to the authorities, I observed. He lacked definitive proof, Winters explained, and by the time his suspicions crystallized, he had already married Margaret. Perhaps he couldn't bring himself to believe she was capable of such an act. Or perhaps, Holmes suggested quietly, he chose a different form of justice, musical rather than judicial. By incorporating Eleanora's theme into his final composition, he ensured her voice would be heard and her talent recognized, directly countering whatever wrong he believed had been done to her. A subtle revenge, I mused, or a testament to the enduring power of truth, Holmes countered. Sir Richard believed music would speak what words could not, and in this, at least, he was proven correct. As Winters prepared to depart, he paused at the door. "Will you attend the premiere, Mr. Holmes?" My friend, who typically avoided social gatherings with determined vigour, surprised me with his response. "I believe I shall, Mr. Winters. Some mysteries resolve themselves in facts and evidence, others in human emotion and motivation. But this case, unique in my experience, finds its final resolution in music. I am curious to hear how Sir Richard and Lady Eleanora's dialogue concludes." After our visitor had gone, Holmes stood by the window for a long while, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass. Finally, he turned to me with a reflective expression. "You know, Watson, in all my years of detection, I have encountered countless motives for murder, greed, jealousy, fear, revenge. But artistic legacy, the desperate need to control how one's creative voice echoes through time, that is a motive of rare and terrible power. And yet," I offered, "through your efforts, both voices will now be heard as they were meant to be." Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is justice of a sort. The violin that played after death has ensured that truth, like music, endures beyond the grave." He lifted his own violin from its case and began to play, not one of his usual frenetic pieces, but something contemplative and strangely moving. Though I never asked, I've always wondered if he was improvising his own response to the melody that had driven Sir Richard Crandall's killer to such desperate acts, adding his voice to a conversation that had already spanned life and death.